The stereotypical perception of the 1950s involves white picket fences and domestic bliss. But what about sex in the 1950s? Sexual mores and taboos throughout history often challenge perceived ideas about a society and sometimes even come to define a lot of what we know about historic groups entirely. Think of the sexual practices of ancient Romans. Their sex practices are closely linked with some of the best-known stories about their lives. Sex and history are linked, and even some of the worst moments in time have their stories to tell. Sex and sexuality in the 1950s is no different. Marriages in the 1950s were supposed to be peachy. Just look at those 1950s marriage manuals, and homosexuality in the 1950s was forbidden. But what about the reality of sex and relationships? Was it as straightforward as the 1950s would like you to believe? Before we start, be sure to subscribe and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos. This is the channel Learning the World. Let's go! STIs were fairly common, but the risks seemed unimportant. During World War I and World War, sexually transmitted infections spread at exponential rates. Syphilis was a particularly devastating infection, but with the discovery of penicillin in 1928, a cure became possible. While penicillin wasn't used to treat syphilis on a widespread level until the 1940s, the incidence rate of syphilis fell by 95% and its death rate fell by 75% between 1947 and 1957. Once there was a cure for syphilis, people began engaging in riskier sex habits. During the 1950s, the illegitimate birth ratio, the share of U.S. births by teens, and the incidence of gonorrhea all dramatically increased. Gonorrhea, which declined once antibiotics were discovered, was believed to have been almost eradicated by the 1950s. By the end of the 1960s, however, gonorrhea cases in the U.S. were back to levels on par with those from the 1940s. Homosexuality was considered a disease and deviant. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, first published in 1952, homosexuality was listed as a mental illness. By 1968 and the publication of the DSM, it was officially a sexual deviation. Medical diagnoses of homosexual behavior prompted resistance from gay communities. As doctors attempted to cure homosexuality through shock therapies, castration, commitment to a mental institution, and lobotomies, backlash against the treatments developed. The American Psychiatric Association didn't take homosexuality out of the DSM completely until 1986. Nuclear families and traditional gender roles were part of fighting communism. After World War, the US and the rest of the world sought to return to quieter and simpler times. At the same time, men were supposed to be strong, to provide, and to prove their masculinity. As a result, the push for a nuclear family with the father as the breadwinner and the mother as the homemaker became essential to preserving the American way of life. This family structure was considered a way to take a stand against communism or the evil Red Menace. This preoccupation, or obsession, with family and gender roles during the 50s reflects how Americans believed they could resist outside or domestic subversion through the strength of a traditional family. Homosexuals were hunted and persecuted just like suspected communists. Just as the nuclear family became a symbol of prosperity and the American dream, homosexuality was perceived as the antithesis to those ideals. Homosexual relationships and interactions likely did still happen, but during the 1950s, these relationships were dangerous and highly illegal. Known as the Lavender Scare, homosexuals were targets of congressional investigations. Congress wanted to put an end to the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in the government, and, in March 1952, the federal government announced its removal of 162 civil servants suspecting of being homosexual. Sexual perversion was added to the reasons why a person could be denied employment with the government in 1953 by President Dwight Eisenhower. Agencies began trying to weed out homosexuals through blackmail and surveilling locations where known LGBTQ+ people spent their time. Marriage manuals trained girls and young women to be good wives. From books presented to girls taking home economics courses to women reading magazines, there were endless guides and manuals for how to be a proper wife. Most of the information remained constant from manual to manual, encouraging girls and women to have dinner ready for their husbands when they got home from work, to be pretty and prepared when he arrives, to have the children ready, and to make sure noise and clutter aren't around to bother him. It was important for girls and women to make sure they made the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner, or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be at home and relax. At the time, a woman's place was not to ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment of integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. By extension, men learned how to be good husbands from these texts as well. Men were supposed to provide for their families and, most importantly, not be sissies. The first transgender woman in the US earned national headlines. Transgender wasn't a word in the 1950s, but when former U.S. Army serviceperson George William Jorgensen, Jr. from the Bronx came out as transgender, it brought understandings of sexuality to new limits. After her transition, Christine Jorgensen said she struggled between the sexes as a child and turned to photography until being drafted into the military. Soon after being discharged from the Army in 1946, Jorgensen transitioned to a woman. Jorgensen went to Denmark to have hormone treatments and undergo several surgeries. In 1953, Jorgensen returned to the US after the surgery had been made public the previous year. The New York Daily News broke the story December 1, 1952, with the headline "EXGI becomes blonde beauty." Jorgensen was met by reporters when she arrived at the airport, where she answered several questions. She later told her story to magazines, became a celebrity, and then a nightclub entertainer in New York. According to historian Jenny Beeman, Jorgensen became a sensation, in part, because she had been a U.S. serviceman, the epitome of masculinity in post-World War II America, and had been reborn into a blonde bombshell, the symbol of 1950s white feminine sexuality. Before returning to the U.S., Jorgensen wrote her family to tell them what to expect. In her letter she said, "I have changed very much, as my photos will show, but I want you to know that I am an extremely happy person and the real me, not the physical me, has not changed. I am still the same old broad. But nature made a mistake, which I have had corrected, and I am now your daughter." Her family was said to have been very supportive. Alfred Kinsey argued Americans were into all kinds of sexual behaviors. When Alfred Kinsey reported on male and female sexuality in 1948 and 1953, respectively, the results were shocking. Kinsey, who founded the Institute for Sex Research at the University of Indiana in 1947, interviewed thousands of people about their sexual habits and created a spectrum of sexuality from total heterosexual to homosexual and even asexual. His reports also indicated that nearly 69% of white males in the United States had sex with prostitutes, about half of all married males have intercourse with women other than their wives, at some time while they are married, and that 37% of males had homosexual physical contact to the point of orgasm at least once. Kinsey looked at sexuality in terms of common and less common rather than right and wrong, and while his methods, findings, and even his personal life were criticized, he took the conversation about sex out of the domain of the church and psychoanalysts. Magazines like Playboy got their start amidst sexual repression. Hugh Hefner founded Playboy magazine in 1953, right when society was stressing conservative sexual mores. Hefner, from a conservative family by his own admission, started his magazine as an advocate for a sexually robust lifestyle. With sexually charged covers, politically and socially relevant articles throughout, and nude pictures, Playboy broke new ground. Most men weren't ready to be as sexually explicit as Playboy would have them be, but they found the magazine met their needs in a behind-closed-doors kind of way. This type of expression, according to Hefner, was a kind of argument for a liberal democratic society with emphasis on the freedom of the individual. Playboy turned arguments for conformity as a patriotic action on its heels. By opening up sex to the masses, he was using the American ideal in a revolutionary way. He successfully packaged an attitude, a mindset, a philosophy, and one that ran counter to the superficial tenets of the era. Interracial relationships were illegal and often prompted violence. Another aspect of the 1950s emphasis on conformity was how society reacted to interracial relationships. The complexities of interracial relationships in the US had a long history, but, in this context, a family wasn't supposed to be made up of more than one race. More than that, however, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans and the like were thought to be sexually wild, unstable, and undomesticated. Laws banning interracial marriage, dating, and socializing of any kind existed in dozens of US states. When Richard and Mildred Loving married in 1958, they were exiled from the state of Virginia after having been jailed and fined for their nuptials. The Lovings fought their sentence and their case appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967, where the court ruled in their favor, finding that bans on interracial marriage to be obviously an endorsement of the doctrine of white supremacy. In addition to legal prohibitions, the social risk of interracial relationships could be painful or deadly. When Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi in 1955, it was for having allegedly whistled at a wild woman. Sexual innuendo found expression in popular culture. With sexual repression and conservative values at every turn, another outlet for expression was music and visual media. Particularly appealing to 1950s youths, songs like Little Richard's Good Golly Miss Molly pushed boundaries. She did, after all, sure like the ball. Jerry Lee Lewis' personal life aside, his songs Great Balls of Fire and Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On were banned on radio stations because of their perceived vulgarity. Even songs that may have been innocent reflected sexual tensions of the decade. In 1957, Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers told the story of a young boy and girl that fell asleep at the drive-in and were in a panic about the trouble they found themselves in. Television and movies similarly pushed boundaries. Elvis Presley's performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 shocked audiences with his gyrating so much so that when he appeared again the following year, he was only shown from the waist up. Hollywood was more liberal than its small-screen counterparts, allowing interracial relationships, abortions, and prostitution to appear on film in 1956. This doesn't mean films weren't controversial, however. Baby Doll, released in 1956 and written by Tennessee Williams, showed a teenage girl taunting her husband with her sexuality and was denounced by religious and political conservatives. According to 1950s American culture, a sensual woman was seen a threat to the sanctity of the nuclear family. That's all for today. If you liked the video, put a like and don't forget to subscribe. Bye everyone.